Last time on the I Call Bullshit show, we discussed the first prison industrial complex, Jamestown, and its equal opportunity exploitation policy. We discussed how people distinguished themselves before the classifications of race, how the Irish, who were at the bottom of Europe's food chain, were the first to be enslaved. Though it wasn't flowers, hugs, and kumbaya, America did exist as a multicultural society. But when did it end? The Europeans brought with them their social hierarchy. And to the people of Jamestown, this way of thinking would grow old in the New World. A new institution would be formed, one that would forever change the course of American history. The poor were separated, and blacks would be deemed unhuman. Despite the ideas of equality that come out of the Age of Enlightenment, and the formation of one of the most important documents in history, there was a paradox. Though America was forged under the premise of the equality of all men, America would be forced to reconcile its practice of slavery, and why the men who stood arm to arm with them in their fight against Britain would be forced to live in servitude. So strap on your seatbelts, boys and girls, as we begin. It's Racism Bullshit, Part 2. As we stated in the last episode, slavery was more American than apple pie before baseball, and anyone who was someone wanted to participate. For example, the Jewish people, who had faced discrimination and mistreatment in Europe for centuries, barred from land ownership, expelled by several monarchs, and over time excluded from several professions, and relegated to the lowly and uninteresting world of banking and finance, where surely they would have no influence. In Europe, they were the scapegoats for every disaster, from the execution of the great white savior forsaken by his sky daddy, to poisoning water causing the Black Plague to spread. Jews could come to America and start thriving communities. As it was for any immigrant group, establishing themselves as full participants in their new country was important to Jewish families. Many saw the American slave trade and slavery as a key feature of the American experience. Judah P. Benjamin, one of America's first Jewish senators, was a staunch supporter of slavery, and even argued that conditions of slavery were more humane than that of a white prisoner punished for the same offense slaves were in the North. Benjamin spoke out against Uncle Tom's Cabin and would later join the Confederate States of America. As a community, Jews were overall silent on the issue. But if you think about it, slavery is sanctioned in all Abrahamic religions, and up to this point, the Jews had been fourth-class citizens for at least 1,000 years in Europe, and were enjoying some upward mobility. As war became imminent, Jews became more vocal. New York Rabbi Morris Raffel attempted to make a case for a reconciliation by defending slavery on biblical grounds. By far, America's largest Jewish community, New York's Jews were overwhelmingly pro-Southern, pro-slavery, and anti-Lincoln in the early years of the war. However, as the war continued and the Union had gained momentum, feelings began to shift toward the Union and eventually emancipation. Close to 2,000 Jews from New York State joined the Union forces. During this time of abolition and the righting of an almost 200-year-long wrong, the attitude of whites toward blacks hadn't really changed. Even the great emancipator himself had been quoted making some pretty disparaging remarks about blacks and the cohabitation of blacks and whites. My paramount objection in this struggle is to save the Union, and it is not either to save or destroy slavery. I will say in addition to this, that there is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality. I will say then that I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of white and black races. 161 years after the slave codes, and it seems that it was not the intention of the emancipation to return to the multicultural construct of the colonies that predated institutionalized slavery. Nor was it the intention to create some new colorless class system and refute almost 2 centuries of supposed scientific discovery. The new immigrant class who fueled the labor force were now threatened that their piece of the American dream would be encroached upon by the freshly emancipated blacks. Though being born natives, and in many cases descendants of some of America's original inhabitants, the freed slaves would face discrimination, much like an immigrant population would. However, being stateless, and in most cases visibly different phenotypically from the European immigrants. In the Dred Scott decision of 1857, Chief Justice Roger B. Taney declared that no African person could be a citizen of the United States. Blacks were unable to blend in merely by changing their name and speaking without an accent. Was it that too much had happened, too much cruelty, too much abuse, and the subsequent rationalizations of such violence? It's strange, because the overall attitude of whites had a very fearful undertone, because as we have pointed out, the majority of whites were also lulled into believing that there was an equality of white men in existence, and there really wasn't. Money and ownership was a determining factor to your lot amongst the majority. Even then, the solidarity of all white men was more widely accepted by the poor, who saw this as a means of hope for social mobility. Also, as already we touched on, fresh in the mind of whites was Nat Turner and the 60 white families killed during his uprising. The Reconstruction period, viewed by some as one of the darkest moments in American history, no pun intended. Andrew Johnson, who succeeded Lincoln after his assassination in 1865, handed back the key and placed full power in the hands of white Southerners. Tasked with reconstruction of the South, they enacted the Black Codes that severely limited the rights of former slaves in an effort to force them to return to work as dependent plantation laborers, referred to as sharecroppers. Words of art, like apprentice, and the apprenticeship laws were passed to re-enslave blacks. Children were kidnapped from their homes. In response, the Republican majority in Congress in 1866 initiated its own plans of reconstruction. In the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, they permanently altered the federal system and the nature of American citizenship. Basically, the Constitution was suspended and the South put under martial law. The 4 Reconstruction Acts, which dissolved all governments in the former Confederate states with the exception of Tennessee, divided the South into 5 military districts, where the military, through the Freedmen's Bureau, helped protect the rights and safety of newly freed blacks. Confederate states were required to ratify their constitutions conferring citizenship rights on blacks or forfeit their representation in Congress. To the Democrats, then made up entirely by the former Confederates, it was the radical Republicans in Congress who vindictively forced black supremacy upon the defeated Confederacy. Corruption and misgovernment followed, presided over by unscrupulous carpetbaggers, Northerners who ventured south to reap the spoils of office, and scallywags, white Southerners who cooperated with the Republican Party for personal gain. White Southerners were facing their worst nightmare. Hordes of Northerners had come bringing freed and educated blacks, not to mention the Union soldiers. Fueled by the belief that blacks were by nature incapable of participating in democratic government and that black suffrage was the gravest error of the Civil War period, being held under military occupation while these unfamiliar blacks participated in the legislation process, organizing their former property to act against them politically. This is a very important time in the history of blacks. For the first time since colonialism, they could experience some level of self-determination, even if only a promise. During Reconstruction, only the state legislature of Mississippi elected any black senators. On February 25, 1870, Hiram Rhodes Revels was seated as the first member of the Senate, while Blanche Bruce, also of Mississippi, seated in 1875, was the second. Blacks were elected to national office, also from Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, North Carolina, and Virginia. These Reconstruction-era black senators and representatives were members of the Republican Party. The Republicans represented the party of Abraham Lincoln and of emancipation. The Southern Democrats represented the party of planters, slavery, and secession. From 1868, Southern elections were accompanied by increasing violence in an effort by Democrats to suppress black voting and regain power. In 1870, paramilitary groups such as the White League and Red Shirts worked openly to turn Republicans out of office and intimidate blacks from voting. This followed the earlier years of secret vigilante action by the Ku Klux Klan against freedmen and allied whites. The Ku Klux Klan was responsible for countless number of callous, heartless, ruthless, merciless, and sadistic acts of murder and terrorism, aimed at innocent men and women and children, used as pawns by the Republican Party, who had in effect dismantled the Constitution to reconcile the North and South, and to bring an end to the institution that had been the foundation of American wealth. In terms of the politics, this time was vastly different from any time anyone viewing can recall, unless of course you're an old-ass vampire who survived the mighty acts of Abe the Emancipator. Oh, I'm the only one who watched that movie. The federal government was decentralized before the Civil War, and its powers were limited. There was no national banking system, no national railroad, no national tax system, not even reliable maps of many areas of the country. The Army in 1861 only numbered 14,000 men. The federal budget was microscopic in comparison to today's standards, and nearly all functions of the government were handled at a state and local level. The Civil War was the incendiary that created the modern American national state. To mobilize the North's economic resources, the Lincoln administration instituted the first national banking system and national currency, the first national taxes on income, and the first highly protective tariffs, and laid the foundation for the first transcontinental railroad. The economic policies of the Union built a long-lasting alliance between Republican Party and the national state, and the emerging class of industrial capitalists. This transfer of political power created the conditions that would later make the United States, by the end of the century, the greatest economic power on earth. Before the Civil War, the definition of those entitled to enjoy the blessings of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, protected by the Constitution, was for the most part defined by race. With the enlistment of 200,000 black men in the Union Army, the discussion of black citizenship on the post-war agenda. From the Civil War comes the principle of national or federal citizenship, and the equal protection of all under its laws, which evolved into what we know today as civil rights. Reconstruction ultimately fails, and its measures replaced by Jim Crow, segregation, and tens of thousands of lynchings. With that comes another transformation of notions of race, transformations which in some ways draw perhaps even a harder line between white and black. After the 1876 presidential election of Rutherford B. Hayes, a national agreement between disputing factions of the Democratic and Republican parties was negotiated, resulting in the Compromise of 1877. Democrats conceded the election to Hayes and promised to acknowledge the political rights of blacks. The Republicans agreed to withdraw federal troops from the South and promised to appropriate a portion of federal monies towards Southern projects. With the overthrow of biracial state governments in the South and the withdrawal of the last federal troops from the region by Rutherford B. Hayes in 1877, the Civil War and Reconstruction had come to an end. This time period in general is important for white America because for the first time it would have to divorce its beloved Constitution. Perhaps this, in part, fueled the resentment America has toward blacks, were blacks held responsible for destroying the American dream. Jim Crow operated primarily, but not exclusively, in southern and border states between 1877 and 1965. Slavery, for better or worse, brought white and black people together. They had to work together, lived in close quarters. By defining a person as property, the distinction had already been made between a free person. It was easy. Everything was black and white. Once the legal distinctions of slavery disappeared, Southern whites needed a new system to maintain the social distinctions. A new institution, which was eventually called segregation, is born. New barriers put up to ensure no one could confuse the status of whites and blacks. Black people were now citizens of this nation, with all the rights of citizens. Southerners had to find new and innovative ways to either deny blacks those federally protected rights or to make sure they were not exercised. Central to this new institution, the belief that whites were superior to blacks in all important ways, including but not limited to intelligence, morality, and civilized behavior. Sexual relations between blacks and whites would produce a mongrel race which would destroy America. Treating blacks as equals would encourage interracial sexual unions, an activity which suggested social equality, encourage interracial sexual relationships if necessary. Violence be used to keep blacks at the bottom. Ah, you're paying attention now. Well, you gotta wait till next time. Or just click on the next video. But make sure you like and subscribe for all the new bullshit. Thanks again. Have a good night. Or day. Whatever.